I've never been afraid of Christmas before, and that's probably why what happened still bothers me more than anything else I've experienced. I grew up in a quiet town where winter meant snow-covered streets, yellow porch lights glowing through falling flakes, and the distant sound of carolers echoing down empty roads. Nothing bad ever seemed to happen during that time of year, which is why I didn't think twice about house-sitting for my uncle while he was away for the holidays. His house was on the edge of town, surrounded by pine trees, far enough away that you couldn't see any neighbors from the windows, but close enough that it never felt isolated, at least not during the day. The first night was completely normal. I cooked dinner, watched television, and listened to the wind moving through the trees outside. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, thick and steady, the kind that absorbs sound and makes everything feel quieter than it should. Around 10 p.m., the power flickered briefly but came back on, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything felt. That was the last moment I felt safe in that house. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the side of the house. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing against the siding, but the sound was slow and deliberate, moving along the wall rather than hitting it randomly. I stayed still, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The scraping stopped, replaced by the crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. They were heavy, uneven, like someone walking carefully, trying not to slip. I got out of bed and looked through the front window. The porch light illuminated a stretch of untouched snow, except for a single set of footprints leading up to the front door. They stopped right at the door, facing it, as if someone had been standing there for a long time. My stomach tightened, and I checked the lock, even though I already knew it was secure. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a normal ring. It was held down too long, stretching into an uncomfortable, buzzing sound that echoed through the house. I didn't answer. I just stood there, frozen, watching the door, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, the ringing stopped, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That's when the knocking started. Slow, firm, 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. Whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry. They knew I was inside. I backed away from the door and called my uncle, but the call went straight to voicemail. When I checked my phone, I realized I had no signal at all. The knocking stopped again, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Then I heard footsteps moving away from the door, circling the house. I followed the sound from room to room, watching shadows pass by the windows, always just out of view. At one point, I saw a figure stop outside the living room window, standing perfectly still, facing the glass. The porch light didn't reach that far, so all I could see was a tall, dark outline against the snow. I don't know how long it stood there, but eventually it moved away. I waited until morning before leaving the bedroom. When I opened the front door, the footprints were still there. Only now there were more, dozens of them, surrounding the house, overlapping, circling, as if someone had been walking around it all night. I stayed one more night. That was my mistake. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of Christmas music playing faintly outside. It took me a moment to recognize it, an old, distorted version of Silent Night, playing for what sounded like a cheap speaker. I looked out the window and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, holding something in its hands. As it stepped forward, I realized it was wearing a Santa suit. Not a clean one. The red fabric was dark and stained, the white trim gray and matted. The figure raised its head and looked directly at my window. Then it waved. I locked myself in the bathroom until morning. When the sun came up, the figure was gone, but the music was still playing somewhere in the woods. I left and never went back. Last Christmas, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small speaker and a note that read, "Next year, don't hide." I used to work overnight shifts as a delivery driver during the holidays, mostly because the pay was better and I didn't have much family to spend Christmas with. One year, I was assigned a rural route that passed through several small towns and long stretches of highway with nothing but snow-covered fields on either side. Most of the deliveries were simple, gifts, decorations, last-minute packages. But one stop still bothers me years later. The address was a single-story house at the end of a dirt road, miles away from anything else. The GPS hesitated before guiding me there, like it didn't want to commit to the route. When I arrived, the house looked dark and abandoned, except for a single Christmas tree glowing in the front window. Multicolored lights blinked slowly, illuminating the empty living room behind the glass. I knocked. No answer. Company policy required a delivery attempt. So I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. As I was about to leave the package on the porch, the front door creaked open slightly. A man stood in the doorway, just far enough back that the porch light didn't reach his face. He thanked me quietly and took the box without making eye contact. As I turned to leave, he said, "You shouldn't be out this late." The drive back toward town felt longer than it should have. The radio kept cutting in and out, switching randomly to Christmas songs I didn't recognize, warped and slowed down. About 10 minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me, far back on the road. They kept the same distance no matter how fast I drove. Eventually, the headlights disappeared. When I checked my mirror again, there was a car directly behind me, so close I couldn't see its headlights, just the dark outline of the hood. I sped up, but it stayed right there, matching me perfectly. I turned onto a side road, then another. The car followed every turn. Finally, I pulled over, expecting a confrontation. No car passed me. The road behind me was empty. When I reached the warehouse at the end of my shift, my supervisor asked why I'd returned with an extra package. Confused, I looked in the back of the truck. Sitting on the floor was the same box I had delivered earlier, untouched, with the same address on the label. Inside was a Christmas ornament shaped like a house. Inside the tiny windows, I could see a small figure standing in the doorway, facing outward, smiling. I was 16 the year my parents decided we were spending Christmas at a rented cabin instead of home. It was supposed to be a quiet family holiday, away from distractions, phones, and neighbors. The cabin was deep in the mountains, surrounded by snow-covered trees, and nothing else for miles. The owner had left a note saying the road sometimes disappeared under snowstorms and to avoid driving after dark. At the time, that warning felt unnecessary. It didn't later. The first 2 days were uneventful. We decorated a small artificial tree, cooked together, and played board games by the fireplace. There was no cell service, but we still had electricity and a landline that supposedly worked in emergencies. At night, the forest outside felt impossibly dark, like the light from the cabin stopped abruptly at the tree line. On Christmas Eve, a storm rolled in just before sunset. Heavy snow, thick wind, and complete isolation. The power went out around 9 p.m., leaving us with only candles and the fire. My parents went to bed early, but I stayed up in the living room, watching the fire die down. That's when I heard the knocking. It came from the back door. Not loud, not urgent, just 3 slow knocks, evenly spaced. I froze, listening. Nobody should have been out there. The storm was brutal, and the road was completely buried. I convinced myself it was snow hitting the wood. Then it happened again. This time, I stood up and looked through the small window beside the door. The porch light wasn't working, but the moonlight reflected off the snow just enough to show a figure standing there. It wasn't wearing a coat. It wasn't moving. It was just waiting. I woke my parents. By the time my dad grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, the porch was empty. No footprints. No disturbance in the snow at all. He told me it was probably a tree branch or stress from being away from home. At exactly 1:12 a.m., the knocking returned. This time, it came from the front door. We stayed awake together after that. The knocking moved around the cabin throughout the night. Front door, back door, side window, roof. Always slow, always controlled, never frantic, like whoever it was wanted us awake. At one point, we heard footsteps crunching through the snow around the cabin. I looked out through the upstairs window and saw several figures standing at the edge of the trees. I couldn't see faces, only their outlines. They were all facing the cabin. None of them moved. When morning came, the storm was gone. The forest looked peaceful again. No footprints. No signs of anyone ever being there, except for one thing. Carved into the snow directly in front of the cabin were the words, "Merry Christmas."